For a century, peace had a sound. It wasn't the silence of empty space or the gentle murmur of diplomacy. It was the relentless, grinding hum of the great orbital refineries that choke the skies of every habitable world in the Sol system. It was the percussive clang of magnetic locks on ore haulers the size of cities, the scream of plasma cutters carving up asteroids in the belt, and the low, vibrational thrum of the atmospheric processors on Mars that made your teeth ache while you slept. This was the Syndicate's peace, a piece of productivity, of quotas met and resources shipped, a piece measured in standardized cargo units and quarterly profit margins. Humanity had been welcomed into their galactic concordance not as partners, but as proprietors of a resource-rich backwater system, a willing workforce with a strong back and a weak bargaining position. We were the tireless mechanics, the deep-core miners, the assembly line workers for a galaxy that had long since outsourced its dirty work. They gave us advanced medical technology that extended our lives just enough to work another decade, nutrient pastes that kept us fueled for 16-hour shifts, and gravity stabilizers that made our concrete habitats on Titan and Europa bearable. In return, we gave them everything else: our metals, our gases, our ingenuity, and our silence. Kalen Rourke knew that sound better than his own heartbeat. For 30 years, he had been a shift foreman on the Forge of Hephaestus, a sprawling refinery complex that hung in geosynchronous orbit over Saturn, its skeletal frame a web of shadows against the planet's majestic rings. He was a creature of timetables and pressure gauges, a man whose authority extended only to the next maintenance cycle. His world was one of recycled air, the taste of ozone, and the constant, bone-deep weariness that came from supervising men and women who were trading their lives for a paycheck that barely covered their family's oxygen tax back on Earth. His only solace was the viewport in his small office, a thick pane of reinforced polymer that looked out not at the stars, but down at the swirling, butterscotch clouds of the gas giant below. And on good days, when the station's rotation was just right, he could see Titan, a tiny, tarnished pearl in the blackness. That's where his daughter, Ilara, worked as a geological surveyor on the moonlet colony of Rhea's Lament. She was third-generation off-world, born with the Syndicate's peace in her bones. Yet she still had a fire in her that Kalen had long since allowed to be extinguished in himself. She sent him messages filled with descriptions of methane rivers and nitrogen snow. Her words, a small, defiant spark of poetry in a universe that only understood the language of ledgers. Her last message had arrived 2 days ago. A simple image of a crystalline structure she'd found deep in a hydrocarbon cavern, its facets catching the light of her helmet lamp. The caption read, "They see rocks. Dad, I see cathedrals." He'd kept the image on his console, a tiny, shimmering reminder that not everything beautiful had been strip-mined yet. The news came not as a panicked announcement, but as a sterile, system-wide notification that flashed on his console, right next to the image of Ilara's crystal. Incident report: Rhea's Lament Mining Outpost, 7, catastrophic containment, field failure. Full personnel loss presumed. Deepest regrets. A full report will be issued following the Syndicate's internal review. Kalen stared at the words, the hum of the refinery suddenly fading to a dull roar in his ears. Catastrophic containment field failure. He knew what that meant. For the last 5 years, the foreman of Rhea's Lament had been filing petitions about the outpost's primary energy core. It was a Vex-designed generator, cheap efficient, and notoriously unstable without monthly recalibrations that the Syndicate's regional comptroller had deemed a non-essential expenditure. Kalen had seen the reports. His friend, the chief engineer on the colony, had sent him encrypted copies. They had begged for an overhaul, for replacement parts, for anything. The Syndicate's response was always the same: meet the quota, and the equipment will be addressed in the next fiscal cycle. The full report arrived 12 hours later. It was 3 sentences long, blaming the incident on improper maintenance protocols executed by local human staff. There was no mention of the petitions, the faulty generator, or the ignored warnings. Just blame, neatly packaged and delivered with a digital signature from a faceless corporate entity light years away. 24 hours after that, the final insult came. A credit transfer appeared in Kalen's personal account. The memo line read, "Compensatory stipend loss of designated dependent." It wasn't even enough to cover a month's rent on Earth. They hadn't just killed his daughter. They had audited her, assigned a value to her life, and settled the account. He looked from the credit transfer to the picture of the Crystal Cathedral, and something inside him, something that had been worn down and eroded by 30 years of compliant servitude, finally shattered. He didn't shout. He didn't weep. He just stood up, the weariness in his bones replaced by a strange, cold clarity. He walked out of his office and down the long, graded catwalks of the main processing hub. The men and women of his shift were moving like ghosts, their faces hollow, their movements automatic. Everyone on the forge knew someone who had been on Rhea's lament. It was a sister colony, a place where friends and family worked, a shared outpost in the cold dark. They were all grieving, but they were grieving quietly, the way they had been taught, because the ore still needed to be processed, the converters still needed to be fed, and the quota was non-negotiable. That was the moment Kalen understood the true nature of the Syndicate's peace. It wasn't just about labor, it was about the suppression of grief, the commodification of loss, the complete and total erasure of any humanity that interfered with production. He walked to the central command deck, the nerve center of the entire refinery. He didn't draw a weapon or issue a threat. He just keyed in his foreman's override code, sealed the blast doors, and stood before the station-wide communications panel. He took a deep breath, the recycled air tasting sharp and clean for the first time in years. His voice, when it came, wasn't the booming call of a revolutionary. It was the flat, steady tone of a man issuing a final work order. "This is Foreman Rourke," he said, his words echoing across every deck, every workshop, every mess hall on the forge of Hephaestus. He didn't address the Syndicate or the Concordance. He spoke to the other refineries orbiting Saturn, to the ice haulers near Enceladus, to the lonely deep space relays manned by human technicians. As of this moment, the tools are down. I say again, the tools are down. It wasn't a declaration of war. It was a strike, a quiet, profound cessation of work. And for the first time in a century, a part of the great, grinding hum of the Syndicate's peace fell silent. The response was faster than he expected. The local Syndicate administrator, a being named Praxis, whose gelatinous form appeared on the main view screen, did not plead or negotiate. It issued a threat. Resume a production within 1 cycle. Its synthesized voice droned, or a compliance vessel will be dispatched to restore order. Non-compliant labor assets will be liquidated. Kalen looked at the shimmering, amorphous blob on his screen and felt nothing. He simply cut the transmission. He knew Praxis wasn't bluffing. Corporate security, the compliance cutters, were not soldiers. They were union busters with plasma cannons. Their job was to make examples out of people. He turned to his crew, who had gathered on the command deck, their faces a mixture of terror and a dawning, terrible resolve. "They're coming," he said. "They think we're just workers. They think we're going to punch a clock or beg. They don't know what we are." An old engineer named Lena, a woman whose hands were permanently stained with hydraulic fluid, stepped forward. "What are we?" "Kalen." He looked out the viewport at the massive, articulated arms of the refinery, arms designed to grapple asteroids and feed them into the station's fiery maw. He looked at the high-intensity plasma torches used to slice through kilometers of rock and ice. He looked at the powerful tractor beam emitters that could shift 1,000,000 tons of matter without straining. They didn't have guns. They didn't have torpedoes or shields. They had tools. "We," Kalen said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time, "are the Forge." The compliance cutter Arbitrator arrived in 7 hours. It was a sleek, predatory ship, all sharp angles and weapon emplacements, designed to intimidate. It hailed them, demanding unconditional surrender. Kalen answered by turning the Forge of Hephaestus itself into a weapon. They couldn't outrun it. They couldn't outgun it. So, they didn't try. As the Arbitrator began its strafing run, Kalen, now wired directly into the refinery's primary control systems, did something no military strategist would ever anticipate. He fired the ore launchers, not with munitions, but with slag, a cloud of superheated, molten metal. Thousands of tons of industrial waste was hurled into the cutter's path. It wasn't a projectile. It was a shotgun blast the size of a moon. The Arbitrator's point defense systems flared, vaporizing some of it, but much of it got through, peppering its armor, blinding its sensors, and causing a cascade of microfractures along its bow. While the cutter was reeling, Lena, rerouting power from life support, fired the primary asteroid cutter. It wasn't a beam designed for combat. It was too slow, too wide. But at close range, the sustained, high-intensity energy ray sliced across the Arbitrator's unshielded engine block like a scalpel through flesh. The ship didn't explode in a blaze of glory. It died quietly. Its engine sputtered. Its lights flickered out. And it began to drift. A crippled ghost against the backdrop of Saturn's rings. On the command deck of the Forge, there was no cheering. There was only a stunned, horrified silence. They had done it. They had fought back and won. They had crossed a line, and the silence that followed was heavier and more absolute than the Syndicate's humming peace had ever been. Kalen looked at his hands on the console, hands that had only ever been used to build and maintain. He felt the weight of the dead on the crippled ship, the weight of the choice he had made. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was accompanied by something new, something fierce, and terrifyingly pure purpose. He opened a system-wide broadcast channel, one that reached every human settlement, from the Belt to the Oort Cloud, a channel that the Syndicate surely monitored. His voice was raw, no longer the tired foreman, but something else, something harder, something forged in grief and rage. "This is the Forge of Hephaestus," he said, the name of the old refinery now a declaration, a title. "We are no longer producing. We are collecting a debt. Rhea's lament will be answered for." Across the Sol system, the humming began to falter. First one refinery, then another, Then a whole sector of deep space relays went silent. The tools were down, and the war had begun. The silence that followed the death of the arbitrator was a living thing, a suffocating pressure that filled the command deck of the forge. It was broken only by the frantic hiss of a coolant leak somewhere in the station substructure and the ragged breathing of the men and women who stood frozen at their posts. They had looked into the abyss and thrown a rock at it, and to their astonishment, the abyss had flinched. Now they waited for it to strike back. Kalen felt a tremor in his hand and forced his fingers to uncurl from the control panel. His skin was slick with sweat, the direct neural interface leaving a phantom ache behind his eyes. He had just sent dozens, maybe hundreds, of people to their deaths. They were Syndicate. Yes, enforcers, killers, but they were still people. He had expected to feel a grim satisfaction, a surge of righteous fury. Instead, there was only a vast, hollow emptiness where his grief for Ilara had been, an emptiness now filled with the chilling certainty of what he had unleashed. "Status," he said, his voice a dry rasp. Lena, her face pale under the harsh glow of a diagnostic screen, didn't look at him. "The cutter is dead in the water. No life signs. Our portside grappling arm is slag. And the main ore launcher is offline for at least a full cycle due to thermal overload. We're blind on 3 external sensor arrays. We're alive. Kalen." That's the status. Nar, the unspoken question hung in the air between them for how long the Syndicate was not an entity that tolerated defiance. It was a vast, sprawling machine of commerce, and the forge was a broken cog that had just stripped a gear. The machine would not shut down. It would simply replace the broken parts, violently if necessary. The first sign of the Syndicate's true response came not as a fleet, but as a voice. It was a human voice, calm and measured, cutting through every communication channel in the system. The face that appeared on the main view screen was handsome, severe, with the kind of placid confidence that came from a lifetime of unwavering authority. His name was Director Valerius, the Syndicate's special administrator for the Sol sector, a human elevated to a position of power few of his species ever reached. He stood not on a warship's bridge, but in a serene, wood-paneled office, a window behind him showing the gentle curve of Earth. He didn't speak of rebellion or attack. He spoke of stability. "Workers of the Sol system," Valerius began, his tone paternal. "Disappointed. A tragedy has occurred. A foreman, Kalen Rourke, suffering from extreme psychological distress following a personal loss, has seized control of the Forge of Hephaestus. In his delusion, he has disabled a compliance vessel sent to render aid and has taken his entire crew hostage. He has endangered thousands of lives and disrupted the vital flow of resources that ensures the survival of us all." Kalen watched, his hands clenched into fists. Valerius was brilliant. He wasn't casting Kalen as a revolutionary. He was painting him as a madman, a terrorist holding his own people captive. "To the crew of the Forge," Valerius continued, his gaze seeming to pierce the screen and find every fearful face on the command deck, "we offer a path back. The Syndicate bears you no ill will. Power down your systems. Detain Foreman Rourke. Full amnesty will be granted. Your lives and your livelihoods will be protected." Then his expression hardened just enough to reveal the steel beneath the velvet. "This offer is valid for 24 hours. After that, the Forge of Hephaestus will be reclassified from a productive asset to a quarantine zone, A fleet is being dispatched to ensure the containment is absolute. The transmission ended, leaving behind a silence more profound than before. Quarantine zone. Containment. The words were sterile, corporate, but their meaning was clear extermination. Panic, held at bay by shock and adrenaline, began to ripple through the crew. Murmurs turned into anxious questions. A technician near the back of the deck threw his headset down in disgust. "He's right," the man spat, his voice trembling. "We followed you. Rourke, we fought. Now what we're trapped here. They're going to burn us out of the sky." Before Kalen could answer, Lena stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a cold fire he had never seen in her. "Shut up, Marcus," she snapped, her voice cutting through the rising fear. "You think begging is going to save you. You think they'll forget we melted the arbitrator, we crossed the line. The only way now is forward." She turned to Kalen, her expression a mix of challenge and desperation. "But he has a point. Kalen, what is the plan? We're a stationary target with dwindling supplies and a corporate fleet on the way." Fighting back was a good speech. "Now we need a blueprint." He met her gaze, seeing not just an engineer, but the conscience of his crew. She was right. He had been so consumed by the act of defiance that he hadn't truly considered the consequences. He had no military training, no grand strategy. He was a foreman. He knew how things were built. He knew their tolerances. And he knew their breaking points. He turned to the main schematic of the refinery that dominated one wall of the command deck. For 30 years, he had looked at it as a single, immutable structure. Now, he saw it differently. He saw it as a collection of parts. "We're not a stationary target," he said, his voice low, an idea taking shape, as audacious as it was insane. "We're a construction yard. Valerius gave us 24 hours. We're going to use every second of it." His plan was madness, born of desperation and a lifetime of industrial engineering. The forge was too big to move, a city-sized web of gantries, processors, and habitats, but it was modular, built in sections over decades. At its heart was the primary processing core, Section Gamma, a heavily armored, self-contained unit that housed the main fusion reactors, the primary life support systems, and the command deck. It was the oldest, most durable part of the station. "We're going to cut ourselves free," Kalen explained, tracing a line on the schematic with a shaking finger. "We'll use the maintenance cutters to sever the structural pylons connecting Section Gamma to the rest of the refinery. It will be a controlled demolition." A young pilot, a hothead named Jax, who flew Ore interceptors, laughed without humor. "Great. So we become a smaller stationary target. What then? We throw wrenches at them." "No," Kalen said, pointing to the docking bay where the massive, long-haul ore freighters were moored. "We take their engines. We cannibalize the primary drives from 3 of the heavy haulers. They're not combat drives, but they have enough thrust to get this chunk of rock moving. Lena," he turned to her, "can you rig a power conduit to bypass their limiters? Run them hot from our main reactor?" Lena stared at the schematic, her mind working furiously, calculations flashing behind her eyes. The sheer complexity was staggering. It wasn't just rerouting power, it was fabricating new plasma injectors, jury-rigging a cooling system, and integrating 2 completely different operating systems under extreme pressure. "It's impossible," she whispered, and then a slow, manic grin spread across her face. "But we can try." The forge transformed from a silent monument of defiance into a maelstrom of frantic activity. Every worker, from the lowest level pipefitter to the most experienced engineer, was given a task. Teams in EVA suits swarmed over the station's exterior, planting industrial-grade cutting charges along the pylons. Others stripped the ore haulers, their interiors echoing with the shriek of metal being torn apart. On the command deck, Lena and her team worked in a fugue state, their consoles littered with empty stimulant bulbs as they rewrote thousands of lines of code to force the station systems to accept the foreign engines. Kalen was everywhere, a phantom moving through the chaos, coordinating the efforts, pushing his people past the brink of exhaustion. He saw the doubt in their eyes, but he also saw a flicker of something else, the fierce pride of builders. They were not soldiers learning to fight. They were artisans of steel and plasma. And this impossible task was the greatest thing they had ever built. They called their new creation the Hephaestus. It was not a name born of hope, but of grim, metallic truth. They were the Forge, and this was their monstrous, misshapen child. 18 hours in, fragmented reports started filtering in from across the system. The strike was spreading, but the Syndicate's response was brutal. The orbital refineries of Jupiter were shelled into submission. A transport full of striking miners leaving the belt was vented into space. Valerius was not containing a riot. He was purging a disease. The news hardened their resolve. There was no going back. There was no amnesty. There was only this ship, this one desperate gamble. With 3 hours to spare, the final engine was grafted onto the severed hull of Section Gamma. It was an ugly, asymmetrical beast, a city block of scarred metal and exposed conduits with 3 colossal engines bolted to its stern like an afterthought. It was a testament to defiant engineering, a middle finger to the sleek, sterile designs of the Syndicate. They're here. Jax's voice crackled over the comms from his scout ship, which was hiding in Saturn's rings. Valerius's fleet, 6 cutters and a damn cruiser. They're taking up attack formation. Kalen stood on the bridge of the Hephaestus. The rest of the Forge was a ghost station around them, powered down and silent. Lena, are we ready? The reactor is redlining, and the inertial dampeners are a prayer at best, she replied, not looking up from her console, but the engines are online, I think. Good enough, Kalen said. He opened a channel to the fleet. Director Valerius, you came for a madman in a refinery. You'll find something else. Through the main viewport, they watched the Syndicate fleet approach, their weapon ports glowing. Valerius's voice, cold and final, came back. Your time is up. Rourke, this is your last chance to prevent further loss of life. There's only one life I'm concerned with losing today, Kalen said quietly, more to himself than to the director. And it isn't mine. He gave the order. Fire the charges. A series of silent, brilliant flashes erupted along the pylons. The Hephaestus shuddered, the groan of protesting metal echoing through the deck plates. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a final, violent lurch, they broke free. They were adrift. Bring the engines online, Kalen commanded, his knuckles white on the railing. All of them. The deck vibrated with a low, gut-wrenching thrum that escalated into a deafening roar. The cobbled-together engines ignited, spitting raw, uncontrolled streams of blue-white plasma. The Hephaestus began to move, sluggishly at first, then with agonizing momentum. On the screen, the Syndicate fleet, caught by surprise, adjusted their targeting solutions. A wave of plasma torpedoes streaked toward them. "Grapplers!" Kalen yelled. They didn't have shields, but they had the remaining asteroid grappling arms. Two massive, multi-jointed claws, each the size of a frigate, swung out from the hull. One arm caught a torpedo in its magnetic grip and flung it back toward the fleet. The other simply swatted two more out of the sky like insects. It was crude, clumsy, but it worked. "Fire the cutter," Kalen ordered. Lena rerouted power, and the massive plasma beam they had used on the arbitrator lanced out. It wasn't a weapon. It was a tool, slow and imprecise. But Kalen didn't aim for the ships. He aimed for the now abandoned superstructure of the old refinery. The beam sliced through a massive, hollow fuel tank, igniting the residual vapors in a catastrophic explosion. The blast wave, a cloud of shrapnel and incandescent gas, slammed into the Syndicate fleet's flank, scattering their formation and buying the Hephaestus precious seconds. They lumbered through the gap, their stolen engines screaming in protest, the hull groaning under the strain of maneuvers it was never designed to perform. They were not graceful, they were not fast, but they were live, and they were free. As they cleared the last of the wreckage and Saturn shrank behind them, Kalen looked at the faces of his crew. They were exhausted, terrified, and triumphant. They had taken their prison and turned it into their salvation. He looked out the viewport, not at the familiar planets of his home, but at the infinite, star-dusted blackness of the outer system. They had escaped, but they were now fugitives. A single, broken ship against the full might of a galactic power. The weight of his choice, the weight of their lives, settled on his shoulders, heavier than any planet. The war wasn't over. It had just been given a name, Hephaestus. The silence of deep space was a lie. Aboard the Hephaestus, silence was the constant, groaning protest of a hull under stresses it was never meant to endure. The arrhythmic hiss of failing life support in non-essential corridors, and the low, anxious murmur of a crew that had traded one prison for another. They had escaped Saturn's orbit, a lumbering, wounded beast fleeing the hunter, but now they were adrift in the vast, unforgiving wilderness between the outer planets, a place where the only law was the remorseless mathematics of fuel consumption and oxygen supply. Kalen stood on the makeshift bridge, the command deck of the old refinery section, and stared at the star charts projected on the main view screen. For 3 weeks, they had been running a series of short, desperate burns designed to keep them out of the Syndicate's immediate grasp. But every jump cost them precious fuel, and every course correction was a gamble. They were not a warship, they were a city block with engines strapped to it, and their heat signature was a bonfire in the dark. So far, they had survived through a combination of Lena's engineering genius and Jax's reckless piloting. Jax, flying his tiny scout ship in ever-widening circles around them, was their eyes and ears, his sensors sniffing for Syndicate patrols. He was young, arrogant, and flew like a man with a death wish, but his instincts had saved them twice already from stumbling into corporate kill boxes. Lena, meanwhile, was engaged in a constant battle with the ship itself. The stolen hauler engines were unstable, prone to violent power surges that threatened to tear their cobbled-together vessel apart. She and her team lived on stimulants and raw nerves, coaxing, cursing, and patching a system that was fundamentally, suicidally flawed. Every crew member was pulling double, sometimes triple duty. Cooks were learning to recalibrate atmospheric scrubbers. Pipe fitters were being trained to man the grappling arms as point defense gunners. Fear was a constant companion, but it had been tempered by a grim, shared purpose. They were the crew of the Hephaestus, the first free humans in the Sol system, and they would not be the last. "We have a problem." Lena's voice cut through his thoughts. She walked onto the bridge, her face smudged with grease, her eyes hollowed out by exhaustion. She held up a data slate, its screen glowing with red warning indicators. "The primary fuel converter is failing. We've been running it too hot for too long. The iridium catalysts are degrading. At this rate, we'll be lucky to get another 2 burns out of her before the engines sputter out completely." Kalen felt a familiar coldness seep into his bones. They were stranded. "How long do we have?" 48 hours of main power, maybe 72 on emergency life support after that, she said, her voice flat. "Then we start turning into a very ugly, very expensive coffin." He looked at the star chart again, a vast map of their own helplessness. They were deep in the Kuiper Belt, a sparsely populated region of ice asteroids and a few hardy, independent mining colonies that had managed to eke out an existence far from the Syndicate's direct control. These were the Outlanders, rugged individualists who valued their autonomy above all else. They traded with the Syndicate when they had to, but they answered to no one. Their closest haven, if it could be called that, was a station known as Palace's Folly. It wasn't much. A collection of hollowed-out asteroids lashed together, a notorious den of smugglers, mercenaries, and political exiles. It was a place where a ship could get repairs and fuel, provided they had something to trade and didn't ask too many questions. "Set a course for Palace's Folly," Kalen ordered. "It's our only shot." Jax's voice crackled over the comms, laced with skepticism. Palace's Folly, Kalen. Those people would sell their own mothers for a tank of refined helium. We show up in this wreck, flashing our wanted posters, and they'll hand us over to the Syndicate on a silver platter. They might, Kalen conceded. But Outlanders hate the Syndicate more than they love profit. They hate anyone who tells them how to live. We're not just a ship in need of repairs. Jax, we're a symbol. We're the biggest no this system has heard in a century. We just have to make sure they see that before they see the bounty on our heads." As they limped toward the asteroid station, a new message from Valerius found them. It was broadcast system-wide, a chilling update to his previous pronouncements. He no longer referred to Kalen as a disturbed individual. The language had shifted. Now, Kalen and the crew of the Hephaestus were labeled insurrectionists. Their actions an act of systemic terrorism. The bounty for their capture, dead or alive, was enough to buy a small moon. But there was a new, insidious twist. Valerius announced the implementation of the Collective Responsibility Mandate. Any settlement, colony, or station found to be providing aid or shelter to the insurrectionists would be deemed a co-conspirator. Their syndicate charters would be revoked, their assets seized, and their populations subject to re-education and reassignment. He was turning the entire system into a network of informants, using fear to isolate them completely. Palace's Folly was even more chaotic than the story suggested. Ships of every shape and size were docked at precarious angles to the spinning cluster of rocks. their hulls scarred and patched. The station's internal comms were a cacophony of competing languages and coded barter requests. It was a place that ran on desperation and mistrust. Kalen hailed them, using an old encrypted miners channel. Palace Control, this is the independent freighter Wanderer, requesting permission to dock. We need emergency repairs and fuel. The voice that answered was female, laced with gravel and suspicion. We don't get many wanderers out this far looking like a city fell on them. State your cargo and your business. Our cargo is our crew, Kalen replied. Our business is survival. We have refined metals and high-grade industrial polymers for trade. There was a long pause. He could almost hear the calculations being made, the risk being weighed against the potential reward. Docking Bay 7 Gamma, the voice finally conceded. But you're on a short leash. Any trouble, and we vent the whole bay. Docking was a nightmare. The Hephaestus was a clumsy giant in a harbor built for nimble smugglers. They scraped 2 smaller ships and nearly took out a docking pylon, earning a stream of creative curses from the station controller. Kalen knew they couldn't stay on the ship. They needed to negotiate face-to-face to make their case before the Syndicate's bounty became too tempting to ignore. He decided to go himself, taking only Lena and Jax. Lena, because she could assess the station's repair capabilities and speak the language of engineers. Jax, because he claimed to know the layout and, despite his bravado, was a surprisingly good judge of character. The air in Palace's Folly was thick with the smell of unrecycled sweat, ozone, and alien cooking spices. The central hub was a sprawling cavern carved out of the largest asteroid, a multi-leveled maze of makeshift bars, workshops, and marketplaces lit by flickering neon signs and the cold glow of holographic advertisements. Beings of a dozen different species jostled past them, a testament to the station's position as a crossroads of the galactic fringe. They were met at the airlock by a woman who matched the gravelly voice from the comms. She was tall, whip-thin, with a cybernetic arm that whirred softly with every movement, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. A faded tattoo of a coiled serpent snaked up her neck. "I'm Anya," she said, her eyes sweeping over the 3 of them, lingering on the raw exhaustion etched into their faces. "I run this folly, and you are not the Wanderer." Kalen didn't try to lie. "No, we're the Hephaestus." Anya's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something respect. Perhaps, or just professional interest passed through her eyes. "Rourke," she stated, not as a question. "Valerius is offering a king's ransom for your head. And he's promising to burn any station that helps us." Jax countered, his hand hovering near the sidearm strapped to his thigh. Anya's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. "The Syndicate has been making promises to the Outlands for 50 years. We're still here. Talk is cheap. Your refined metals are not. What do you need? Iridium catalysts for our fuel converter," Lena said immediately. "And access to a dry dock with heavy lifting capabilities. Your power grid couldn't handle our engines. So we'll need to use our own reactor to power the repairs." Anya considered this, her cybernetic fingers drumming a silent rhythm on her thigh. "The iridium I can get. It'll cost you every scrap of polymer on your ship. The dry dock. That's more complicated. Using your own reactor will light the station up like a supernova on any Syndicate long-range scan. They'll know you're here." "They're coming for us anyway," Kalen said. "The only question is whether we're able to fight back when they arrive." And what's in it for us? Anya asked, her gaze unwavering. Why should the people of Palace's Folly risk their necks for a foreman with a stolen refinery? This was the moment, the crux of it all. He wasn't just buying parts, he was selling a cause. Because today it's us, Kalen said, his voice quiet but resonant in the noisy corridor. Tomorrow, Valerius will invent a new mandate, maybe collective taxation, maybe mandatory resource requisition. He's not just hunting us. Anya, he's tightening the leash on the entire system. He's reminding everyone that the Syndicate's peace is conditional, and the conditions can change without notice. We're not just a ship. We're the flaw in his logic. We're the proof that the leash can be broken. Help us. And you're not just helping one crew. You're telling the Syndicate that the Outlands are not their private junkyard. Anya was silent for a long time, her gaze distant. She looked around at the chaotic, vibrant mess of her station, at the defiant, independent souls who called it home. The Syndicate wants order, she finally said, a note of deep-seated weariness in her voice. They think chaos is a weakness. They don't understand that out here. It's how we survive. She looked back at Kalen, her decision made. You'll have your dry dock, but you work fast. And your crew stays on your ship. My people are skittish. The less they see of you, the better. As Lena and a team of Anya's engineers began the delicate, dangerous work of repairing the Hephaestus, news arrived that sent a shockwave through the station. Valerius, making good on his threat, had declared the entire Kuiper Belt a restricted military zone. He had blockaded the main trade routes, citing the need to contain the insurrectionist threat. He wasn't just hunting them anymore, he was strangling the Outlands, cutting off the flow of supplies to a dozen independent colonies. The mood on Palace's Folly soured instantly. The skittishness Anya had mentioned curdled into open hostility. Crews from other ships glared at them as they passed. A fight broke out in a bar when one of Jax's pilots was recognized. They were no longer symbols of defiance. They were the cause of the blockade, the reason a Syndicate fleet was now parked on the edge of their territory. Anya summoned Kalen to her office, a cluttered room overlooking the main docking bay. The council is turning on you, she said without preamble. The other ship captains, the guild merchants. They're scared. The blockade is killing them. They're talking about taking Valerius's deal, handing you over to get the trade lanes reopened. We're almost done, Kalen insisted. Lena just needs 12 more hours. You don't have 12 hours. Anya shot back. You have maybe 3 before they storm your ship. I can't stop them. Not all of them. A Syndicate drone, a sleek, black messenger craft, streaked past the office viewport and docked at a private bay. And it seems Valerius is tired of waiting for an invitation. Through the viewport, Kalen saw him emerge. Director Valerius himself, flanked by a squad of heavily armed compliance guards, had come to Palace's Folly. He wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to collect. Kalen looked from Valerius's confident stride to the angry mobs forming in the station's corridors. They were trapped, caught between the cold, corporate blade of the Syndicate and the hot, desperate fear of the Outlanders. The symbol of hope had become a lightning rod for disaster. The arrival of Director Valerius sent a jolt of ice-cold dread through the Hephaestus. On the bridge, the crew watched the monitor feed from the docking bay, their faces grim. Valerius moved with an unhurried grace, a predator utterly confident in its own territory. He wasn't there for a fight. He was there to close a deal, to surgically remove the cancer of their rebellion and restore the profitable, orderly hum of his system. Anya's voice crackled over Kalen's private comm. He's broadcasting a station-wide address from the central hub. He's offering to lift the blockade and pay triple the bounty. In exchange for you, the council is meeting him now. You're being sold. Rourke. Kalen looked at Lena, who had just returned from the dry dock. Her face streaked with coolant and fury. How much longer? The primary catalyst is seated, but we haven't run a diagnostic, she said. Her voice tight. The power conduits are a mess. Firing the engines now is a 50-50 shot. Either we jump or we detonate with enough force to turn this entire folly into a new asteroid field. A 50-50 chance of oblivion. The odds felt grimly appropriate. He turned to Jax, who had been monitoring the chatter from the station's internal networks. What's the mood down there? Ugly. Jax spat. The merchants are all for it. A few of the old mining clans are holding out, arguing that dealing with the Syndicate is suicide, but they're outnumbered. Anya's trying to stall them, but she's losing the room. They're giving you 1 hour to surrender. 1 hour. The number felt like a physical blow. They had come here seeking refuge and had brought the wolf to the door of the one place that had offered them a hand. Kalen looked at the faces of his crew on the bridge. He saw the same fear he felt, but beneath it, there was a hard, stubborn defiance. They were no longer just refinery workers. They were the crew of the Hephaestus. They had faced down a compliance cutter. They had rebuilt their world in the void. They would not end their journey in the cold calculus of a merchant's ledger. A new strategy began to form in his mind. Not a battle plan, but a foreman's solution. He had always been a builder. Now, he would orchestrate a demolition. Jax, he said, his voice calm. Get your scout ship ready. I want you to plant mining charges on the primary docking clamps holding us to the dry dock. Don't detonate them. Just have them ready on my mark. Jax's eyes widened. A slow, dangerous grin spreading across his face. You're thinking what I think you're thinking. Lena. Kalen continued, ignoring him. That 50-50 chance. Can you improve the odds if you bypass the secondary safeties and channel all auxiliary power directly into the engine ignition sequence? Improve the odds of what geesh, she retorted. Jumping or blowing up Kalen. That's not just redlining the reactor. That's ripping out the red line and throwing it away. If there's even a fractional power fluctuation, the containment field will collapse. I know, he said, meeting her gaze. Can you do it? She held his stare for a long moment, the unspoken question hanging between them. Do I trust you? She gave a sharp, reluctant nod. I can do it, but you'll only get one shot. The system will be fused slag the second after ignition. One shot is all we'll need, he said. He then turned to the comms officer. Get me Anya on a secure audio-only channel. Anya's voice was strained when she answered. It's not looking good. Kalen, they're about to vote. Forget the vote, Kalen said, his voice low and urgent. I have another offer for the council. You're going to deliver it for me. You told me the Syndicate thinks chaos is a weakness. It's time we showed them it's a weapon. In the central hub of Palace's Folly, Director Valerius stood before the assembled captains and merchants, a portrait of magnanimous power. Your cooperation will be noted and rewarded, he was saying, his voice smooth as polished steel. This is not an act of aggression. It is a restoration of order, a simple commercial transaction that will benefit us all. Courier, just as the head of the Merchants Guild was about to formally accept the terms, Anya stepped forward, her cybernetic arm raised for silence. Director Valerius, she said, her voice ringing with authority. Foreman Rourke has a counteroffer. Valerius allowed himself a small, condescending smile. Does he? I can't imagine what a fugitive in a broken ship could possibly offer. He offers you a choice, Anya said, her eyes scanning the faces of the wavering council members. He asks that you consider the true cost of this transaction. He has instructed me to inform you that the Hephaestus is not merely a ship. It is, as he puts it, a bomb. A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. A bluff. Valerius scoffed. A desperate, pathetic bluff. Is it? Anya countered, her voice dropping. His chief engineer has bypassed the safeties on their main reactor. He has tied the engine ignition sequence directly to the primary power core. If they are fired upon, if their hull is breached, or if they choose to do so themselves, the resulting explosion will not just destroy their ship, it will obliterate this station and everything within a 10,000-kilometer radius. That is his offer. Director, leave now, under a flag of truce, or he will turn this folly into his funeral pyre, and he will take you, your guards, and every soul on this rock with him. The hub fell silent. The condescending smile vanished from Valerius's face, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He was a man who controlled every variable, and Kalen had just introduced an element of pure, suicidal chaos into his perfect equation. He knew that a man who had already lost everything was capable of anything. He looked at the faces of the outlanders around him, at the fear now warring with their greed. They had been willing to sell a fugitive. They were not willing to die for the Syndicate. The balance of power had shifted. Valerius had lost the room. "Tell Rourke," he said, his voice tight with controlled rage, "that this changes nothing. He will be hunted to the ends of the galaxy." "He knows," Anya replied. "He just wants to make sure the galaxy is still there when you find him." As Valerius and his guards retreated to their ship, a new transmission came, not to the station, but directly to the Hephaestus. It was Valerius. "You have made a grave error, Rourke," he hissed, his face a mask of fury on the view screen. "You think this makes you a martyr. It makes you a monster. You just threatened to murder thousands of innocent people to save your own skin. You put them in danger when you brought your fleet here," Kalen shot back. "You put them in danger with your blockade. They were never innocent bystanders in your eyes. They were leverage. I'm just playing by the rules you established." He cut the transmission. He felt a wave of nausea. Valerius was right. He had just held an entire station hostage. The line between defiance and terrorism had become terrifyingly thin. But he had saved his crew. For now. "He's leaving," Jax reported from his scout ship. "The Syndicate drone is undocking, but the fleet is holding its position just outside the debris field." "They're waiting," Kalen muttered. "They know we have to leave. They're just waiting for us to make the first move." The mood on Palace's Folly had turned from hostile to something far more complicated. They were no longer angry at the Hephaestus for bringing the Syndicate down on them. They were terrified. They were trapped in a standoff between a corporate fleet and a suicide bomb. Anya opened a channel back to him. "You made your point, Rourke. Now what's your exit strategy? You can't stay here." "I know," he said. "Get your people to safety. Tell every ship docked at this station to clear the bay. We're leaving. And we're going to create a diversion they won't forget." Under the watchful eyes of the distant Syndicate fleet, a strange exodus began. Dozens of ships, from small freighters to hulking mining barges, began to undock from Pallas's Folly, scattering in every direction like startled fish. It was chaos, a disorganized, panicked flight into the blackness of the Kuiper Belt. To the Syndicate commander, it looked like a station-wide evacuation, a civilian population fleeing the madman in the refinery ship. Their sensors were flooded with dozens of new signatures, each one a potential target, each one needing to be scanned and identified. In the heart of that chaos, the Hephaestus prepared to make its run. "Ready on the docking clamps," Kalen ordered. "Lena, on my mark." He watched the tactical display as the civilian ships cleared the area. The Syndicate fleet began to move, attempting to form a loose cordon to contain the spreading cloud of contacts. Their attention was divided, their perfect formation broken. It was the opening he needed. "Now, Jax," he commanded. A series of small, bright flashes lit up the dry dock as the explosive bolts on the docking clamps fired. "Now, Lena, on the bridge." The lights flickered and died as Lena diverted all power. For a terrifying second, they were plunged into absolute darkness and silence. Then, with a sound like the universe tearing in half, the engines ignited. The ship lurched forward with a force that threw everyone against the bulkheads. The inertial dampeners, as Lena had predicted, were a prayer that went unanswered. It was not a controlled acceleration. It was a detonation. A raw, untamed explosion channeled into forward momentum. The Hephaestus shot out of the dry dock like a cannonball, a misshapen bullet of scorched metal and pure desperation. Kalen, pulling himself back up to the console, looked at the view screen. The Syndicate fleet, caught completely off guard by their sudden, violent launch, was slow to react. Plasma fire stitched the darkness around them, but their sheer, unpredictable velocity made them a difficult target. They weren't flying, they were falling through space at an impossible speed. They had survived the jump. As Pallas's Folly dwindled behind them, Kalen took a shuddering breath. He had gambled with thousands of lives, his own included, and won. But the victory felt hollow. He had saved his people by embracing the very thing he was fighting against, the belief that lives were expendable for a greater goal. A final, encrypted message came through from Anya. There was no video, just a single line of text. "Chaos is a weapon. You taught us that today. The Outlands remember their friends. Fly safe." He looked out at the endless stars ahead. They were alone again. Faster and more powerful than before, but also more isolated. They had a new reputation now. They weren't just rebels. They were the madmen who had threatened to blow up a station. The ones who had faced down Valerius and made him blink. In the eyes of the Syndicate, they were monsters. He could only hope that in the eyes of the rest of the system, they were becoming something else entirely a chance. The weeks that followed the escape from Pallas's Folly were a blur of calculated jumps and silent, nerve-wracking drifts through the forgotten corners of the system. The Hephaestus was no longer just a ship. It was a ghost story, a legend whispered in the dark corners of the void. To the Syndicate, they were a specter of chaos, a glitch in the perfect machine. But to the scattered, oppressed colonies of the Outlands, they were becoming something more. Anya's message had not been an empty sentiment. It was a key. Following her encrypted coordinates, They navigated to a rendezvous point deep within the Oort cloud, a place on no official star chart, marked only by the faint gravitational distortions of a cluster of dark, icy planetoids. What they found there took Kalen's breath away. It wasn't just a ship or two. It was a fleet, a ragtag armada of over 50 vessels, a motley collection of battered mining barges, repurposed ice haulers, grizzled freelance prospectors, and a handful of heavily armed smuggler corvettes. At the heart of it all was Anya's ship, the Serpent's Kiss, its hull a patchwork of mismatched armor plates, looking more like a scarred brawler than a command vessel. Anya greeted them on the bridge of the Hephaestus, her respect for their new, fearsome reputation warring with her innate pragmatism. "You made a lot of noise, Rourke," she said, her cybernetic hand resting on her hip. "The blockade is tighter than a C-clamp, but Valerius overplayed his hand. He tried to starve us into compliance, and all he did was convince everyone that you were right. You've given the desperate a direction." "A direction to what?" Kalen asked, the weight of 100,000 tons of defiant steel settling on his shoulders. "They're builders and traders. Anya, not soldiers. Valerius will crush them." "They know," she said, her voice grim, "but they'd rather die on their feet. They've named you their breaker. They think you have a plan to win this." He looked past her at the fleet of misfits, their running lights like a small constellation of hope in the vast darkness. They were looking to him, the tired foreman who had started a riot. He had no illusions of military victory. Brute force was the Syndicate's game. They could never win by playing by those rules. But a foreman knows that every machine, no matter how large, has a single, critical point of failure, a linchpin. For the Syndicate in the Sol system, that linchpin was a station known as Nexus Zero. It was not a capital or a shipyard, but the central nervous system of their entire operation, orbiting the distant, captured dwarf planet of Sedna. Nexus Zero was the master control hub for all resource allocation, fleet logistics, and system-wide communications. Every cargo manifest, every patrol route, every credit transfer was routed through its data cores. Valerius ruled from Earth, but his throne was built on the silent, instantaneous data streaming from the Nexus. Kalen gathered the captains of the new breaker fleet in the cavernous, reconfigured ore processing bay of the Hephaestus. He laid out his plan, not on a tactical map, but on a massive engineering schematic. "We can't destroy their fleet," he began, his voice echoing in the vast space. "But we can shut it down. We can pull the plug." The Nexus is the most heavily defended installation in this system. A direct assault is suicide. So we don't assault it, we decommission it. His plan was audacious, a piece of industrial sabotage on a scale that was almost unthinkable. The breaker fleet would split. Jax, now a respected squadron leader, would take the faster corvettes and stage a high-profile raid on the Syndicate's Helium-3 refineries at Jupiter. A diversion so loud and destructive that Valerius would have no choice but to dispatch the bulk of his fleet to respond. Meanwhile, the Hephaestus, accompanied by Anya's ship and a handful of the toughest mining vessels, would make a hard, fast run for Nexus Zero. "We're not going there to fight the station," Kalen explained. "We're going there to perform a hostile maintenance check." Their target wasn't the station's weapon arrays or command bridge. It was the 4 massive thermal regulators that bled the station's excess heat out into space. Lena, after studying stolen schematics provided by Anya's contacts, had found a flaw. A catastrophic, system-ending flaw. If we can use our mining cutters to sever the primary coolant conduits, Lena explained to the stunned captains, and then use our grapplers to physically tear the regulator pylons from the station's hull, the Nexus's core temperature will go critical in under 10 minutes. It won't explode. It will execute an emergency shutdown, a total system-wide cold reboot that would take weeks, maybe months, to reverse. It was the ultimate tools-down command, an act of engineering, not warfare. The final confrontation was a symphony of controlled chaos. Jax's raid on Jupiter was a blaze of glory, a masterpiece of hit-and-run tactics that sent the Syndicate fleet scrambling. As predicted, Valerius, enraged by the audacity, dispatched his flagship, the Order Ascendant, to lead the punitive expedition, leaving Nexus Zero protected by only its local garrison. Kalen and his small task force jumped in on the station's blind side, a brutal, short-range warp that nearly tore their cobbled-together ships apart. They came in not as a fleet, but as a work crew from hell. The station's defenses were formidable, but they were designed to repel warships firing torpedoes, not mining barges launching seismic charges that cracked their shield emitters, or repurposed refinery firing a sustained plasma beam that melted their gun ports into slag. The Hephaestus itself ignored the station's fire, its scarred hull absorbing blow after blow as it lumbered into position. It was a battering ram, a shield, a force of pure, inexorable momentum. "Grapplers away," Kalen commanded, his voice steady amidst the cacophony of explosions and warning klaxons. The massive asteroid claws swung out, not swatting at torpedoes, but latching onto the colossal frame of the first thermal regulator. Metal screamed in protest as the arm strained, its motors whining under the impossible load. On the other side of the station, Anya's fleet did the same. Valerius, realizing he had been tricked, had turned his flagship around and was burning back towards them. But he was too far away. He was forced to watch on his view screen as Kalen Rourke, the foreman, systematically dismantled the heart of his empire with the tools of a common laborer. "The pylon is buckling," Lena yelled over the din. "One more pull," with a final, shuddering groan. The regulator tore free from the Nexus, a multi-kilometer-long tower of metal sent tumbling into the void. Red lights flashed across the station's surface as a chain reaction of system failures began. 1 down, 3 to go. The battle was short, savage, and unlike any the system had ever seen. When the fourth and final regulator was ripped away, Nexus Zero did not die in fire. It died in silence. Its lights flickered and went dark. Its communication signals ceased. Its weapon emplacements went cold. Across the entire Sol system, the hum of the Syndicate stopped. Fleet commands vanished mid-transmission. Cargo manifests froze on merchant screens. The intricate, invisible web of control that had bound humanity for a century was severed, adrift in the silent space near the crippled Nexus. The Order Ascendant arrived, a king returning to a shattered castle. Valerius hailed them, his face on the view screen no longer composed, but a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. "Rourke, you have destroyed everything. For what for a dead girl?" Kalen looked at the image of the man who had commodified his daughter's life, the man who had built an empire on the quiet suffering of billions. He felt no anger, no triumph, only a profound, aching weariness. He stepped forward, his voice broadcast not just to Valerius, but to the listening system. "You were right. Director, I am just a foreman, and a foreman's job is to make sure the machine runs. But when the machine is broken, his job is to shut it down." He paused. The memory of Ilara's last message, the image of her crystal cathedral, flashing in his mind. The tools are down, Valerius. This time, for good. He cut the transmission. He gave no order to fire. The Order Ascendant could destroy them. But it wouldn't matter. Valerius was already defeated, adrift in the silence he had created. His authority gone, his empire a ghost. The war was over. The long, slow, difficult work of building something new was about to begin. Kalen Rourke stood on the bridge of the Hephaestus, the ship born of his grief, and looked out at the silent stars. He had not sought to be a hero, a rebel, or a breaker of chains. He had simply refused to accept the price of the Syndicate's peace. For the first time in a century, the silence in the Sol system was not the sound of compliance. It was the sound of possibility. And in that quiet, Kalen finally found a piece of his own.